Okay, today we're going to start lesson 91. 90 and 91 went together um, during the final week of Jesus' life. It's still entitled Jesus' Response Regarding His Authority. We're still in Tuesday of the last week of his life. You might remember that in the last lesson, we started our discussion about the events that happened on the morning, Tuesday morning, before Christ's death. It's interesting, I read that the Truth for Today commentary says that this day, meaning Tuesday, was one of the longest and most grueling we read about in Christ's ministry. It was a day of course, teaching, a day of questions, a day of conflict, and a day of rejection. You may remember that Jesus was in the temple and immediately started getting questioned about his authority from the Sanhedrin. We know that Jesus turned those questions around, back on him, and then started to teach them and the crowds a lesson. Not necessarily about his authority, but more so about how the Jewish leaders had abused their authority. His lessons consisted of three parables. In the last lesson, we covered the first parable, the parable of the two sons. One son told his father no when he was asked to go work in the vineyard, but then had a change of heart, and he did go. He regretted his initial response. We all regret some of the times the decisions that we make. And in other words, he repented and then did what he knew was the right thing, and he did go into the field, into the vineyard to work. The other son, remember, told his father, "Oh, I'll go. But he lied to him and didn't go at all. And we said that the analogy Jesus used here is the first son represented the common people, especially those who the Pharisees grouped together as tax collectors and harlots. In days past, these sinners, of course, we remember, they had refused to walk in the way of God, but when they heard preaching of John the Baptist and of Jesus himself, what did they do? They repented. They repented. On the other hand, the second son who said, "I will go," but then disobeyed his father, represented those religious leaders who had not kept the commitment they had made to God to begin with. So that's kind of a recap of lesson 90. Any thoughts or comments on that before we go on? Okay, Jesus next told a parable that showed how the religious leaders had used their positions of authority to achieve enrichment, and self-glorification. The parable also exposed their diabolical motives for desiring to kill him. Now, the parable in Roper's book is called the parable of the wicked tenants. Uh, or as it's labeled in some Bibles, the parable of the landowner, as Matthew calls it. And in Luke and Mark, it's called the parable of the vineyard owner. But it's all the same parable. All the same parable. We're going to start out in Matthew chapter 21, and we're going to read verses 33 through 46. Matthew 21, 33 through 46. It says here, "Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a wall around it, and dug a winepress in it, and built a tower, and rented it out to vine growers, and went on a journey. When the harvest time approached, he sent his slaves to the vine growers to receive his produce. The vine growers took his slaves and beat one, and killed another, and stoned a third. Again, he sent another group of slaves, larger than the first, and they did the same thing to them. But afterward, he sent his son to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But when the vine growers saw the son, they said among themselves, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and seize his inheritance." They took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine growers? They said to him, Jesus, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end and will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at the proper seasons. Jesus said to them, "Did you never read in Scripture, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone? This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing fruit of it. And he who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parable, they understood that he was speaking about them. When they sought to seize him, they feared the people because they considered him to be a prophet. Okay, so let's start out by looking at and breaking down the characters in this parable. The landowner is who? God. That's right. Landowner is God. The tenants, a little more difficult. It's the Jewish nation. The Jewish nation. The servants were the prophets. Yep, the prophets. And of course, the Son is Jesus. Verse 33 describes or reflects a common practice of that day for someone who is planting a vineyard. Notice what it says. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, and he dug a wine press in it, and built a tower, and then rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. A wall or hedge was placed around the vineyard to do what? Protect it. It could protect it from possible thieves or wind or weather. In Kansas, along some of these farmsteads, they've got shelter belts, they call them. And they were made during the Depression era, planted. And that helped because of all the dust and stuff. To protect it. Now, the wine press consisted of two tub-shaped holes dug in a rock at different levels. Grapes were placed in the higher hole, and people would walk over them. They were trodden, and the juice ran into the lower hole where it was dipped out. And then the tower was a platform where watchmen were stationed to protect the vineyard from thieves. Kind of like any tower around a fortress, if you will, to make sure and try to foresee any trouble that might be coming. As Roper pointed out in his book, if you read that portion of it, these details about how the vineyard was made up does not have any deep meaning. Okay, it just describes the general layout, helps us understand of what the vineyards were like back then. So keep that in mind. Now, we get into the heart and meat and potatoes of this thing, of the parable. The landowner then rented or leased out the vineyard to vine growers, or as Matthew calls them, vine dressers. And then what did he do? He went on a long journey to a far country, it says. Now, it's important to understand that this was not an uncommon practice for landlords to put their property in the hands of others who would work it, cultivate it, and harvest it. This landowner had a sharecrop agreement, if you will, with his tenants. They were to give him a agreed upon percentage of the produce. Now, this practice is still done today. My relatives in Kansas who farm acres and acres of wheat, they may own, 1,000 acres, but they might rent 2,000 acres. Yeah, 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 and there's advantages to this. There's two ways that you can rent land. You can pay a flat rate amount, you know, for per acre, or you can agree to do the rent based upon a percentage of the yield. Okay. Now, what's the advantages of a flat rate? That's right. Doesn't matter what happens, you know how much money you're going to get, right? Now, the advantages of doing it by the yield is what? You hope for a good crop because let's say your agreement is 1/3 of how many bushels per acre of wheat. And if it produces good, 60, 70 bushels per acre, then you've got quite a bit of money out of that. But if the farmer didn't maybe have a good reputation and sometimes failed to tend to the field as he should, and you're aware of it, maybe you don't want to do that kind of a deal. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. So that's kind of the way you look at it. But either way is certainly workable. And like I said, it's done that way today. Now, going back to the land and tenant sharecrop concept, the sharecroppers were a figure of the leaders of the nation. These men were accountable for how they had treated, or in this case, mistreated, God's heritage. According to Luke's account, the landowner went on a journey for a long time. The analogy here is the appointed leaders had been responsible for God's vineyard, which was what? Or who? Who did that represent? Israel, okay, for many centuries. In fact, let's turn over to Isaiah chapter 5. This parable of the vineyard is even in the Old Testament. One like it. Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 6 says, "Now let me sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved regarding his vineyard. My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. He dug it up and cleared out its stones and planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in its midst and also made a winepress in it. So he expected it to bring forth good grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judea, judge, please, between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why then, when I expected it to bring forth good grapes, did it bring forth wild grapes? And now, please, let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it shall be burned, and break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will lay it waste, it shall not be pruned or dug, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no more, or no rain on it." So that concept is still there. Um, Comments or questions? Yes, sir. The servants were prophets, okay, and the tenants were the Jewish leadership. We said, or the Jewish nation in general. Well, in Roper's book here, he points out the details of how the vineyard was laid out, okay, with the hedge, with the dugout wine press, with the tower. Doesn't have any deeper meaning than just being descriptive of what a vineyard was like. Okay. No, that's good. I hadn't read that any place in all the extra literature or anything like that. They give you the additional reading or anything like that. So, but that's good. That very possibly could be. There you go. You might make a lot of money. Think of me. Any other comments or questions? Okay. So when the harvest time approached, what did the landowner do and what happened? Let's read Matthew 21, 34 through 36. When the harvest time approached, he sent his slaves to the vine growers to receive his produce. The vine growers took his slaves and beat one and killed another and stoned a third. And again, he sent another group of slaves larger than the first, and they did the same thing. Mark and Luke pretty much say the same wording in there. They did the same thing. Now, this atrocious treatment of the landowner's servants reflected the mistreatment of God's prophets, right? In past. They had been persecuted by the Jewish nation in general and by the Jewish leaders in particular. I'm going to call upon some people, please, to get some passages for me. Jack, do you mind doing Jeremiah 7, 25 through 26? Jeanette, could you do Nehemiah 9 and 26? Ed, would you do Hebrews 11, 36 through 38? Can I give a minute for everybody to kind of find that? This will give you the examples of what they did to the prophets. Go ahead with Jeremiah 7, 25 and 26. Yes, sir.
Since the day that your fathers came out of the land of Egypt until this day, I have sent you all my servants the prophets, sending them daily again and again. Yet they did not listen to me or incline their ears, except to their neck. They did more evil than their fathers.
Okay, Jeanette. Thank you. Ed, Hebrews 11. Yeah, they were mistreated back then, just like they were here in the story being told, the parable. You know what's interesting to me is that in an unusual show of grace, the landowner did not immediately send a force to remove the tenants after the first servants were beaten, killed, and or stoned. What does he do next? He sent more servants, even in greater number, to collect what was his. And what happened? The same thing. Same thing. So instead of bringing judgment upon the wicked men right then and there, which they deserved, the landowner decided to give them one last opportunity to fulfill their obligation to him. And as a last resort, the landowner sent who? His only son, believing what? They will respect him. Now, this kind of makes sense. You know, somebody, a father in a business and has maybe children working for him, they can go out and represent the company, represent their father, and you would think that they would hold some degree of respect for that person because of who his father is and what kind of a job they're doing. Uh, but they believed, the landowner believed that they would respect him and not harm him, as it says in verse 37. Let me find it here real quick. But afterward, he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." Mark says, "beloved son." Not too hard to figure out who it is that we're talking about here. It's Jesus. So what happened to the son? Killed him too. Killed him too. It's absolutely amazing. What was their reasoning for killing the son? To get that's right. He was the only heir to this vineyard, okay? And in Jewish law, Jewish custom, if there was nobody who owned a piece of land, it's kind of like squatters' rights. You're on it, you're working it, they could have taken it over. They could have taken it over. Amazing. At the conclusion of the parable, Jesus asked the Jewish leaders how they thought the owner would react to the vine growers murdering his son. And notice their answer. He will bring those wretches to a wretched end and will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at the proper season. It's interesting. Once again, they answered correctly, but they self-incriminated themselves. Jeanette? Right. Yeah, they knew. Their pride, their arrogance, all that. That's right. That's right. They answered correctly, self-incriminated themselves, self-indicted themselves. Um, they demonstrated their unworthiness to be in positions of authority over God's people. Jesus ended the parable by quoting Psalms 118, 22, and 23. His meaning was clear. Jesus himself was the chief cornerstone, but the Jewish leaders had rejected him in verse 42. In spite of the rejection of him, he still became the chief cornerstone in the new building of God, the church. Look at verse 41. It says, where it does say other vine dressers, and in verse 43 where it says nation, Mark and Luke say others. What or who is he referring to? The Gentiles. Yeah, Gentiles. And we see that in Acts 13, 46 and 18 and 6. When the Jews rejected the gospel, God's messengers then would turn to the Gentiles. Thoughts or comments? Yes, Mark. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Just amazing. Yep. I know what you mean. Jeanette? Yeah, they're still looking for the earthly one. Yes, it does. Right. Absolutely. Good point. Jesus wraps up this parable in verse 44 where he says, "And he who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust." And what this means is if you take a clay pot and you throw it against a stone, it's broken. And as one lying beneath a falling stone, one gets crushed. So, in other words, are those who rejected Jesus then and who reject Jesus now as the Messiah. Okay? They were then and they will be now doomed. Doomed. Jesus' friends had not always understood his parables. Luke 8:9 talks about that. His disciples didn't even at times. But on this occasion, rest assured, even his enemies had no trouble making application. Look at 45, verse 45. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they understood that he was speaking about them. And of course, their hatred for Jesus intensifies. It basically says they wanted to grab him again when they sought to seize him in verse 46. They feared the people because they considered him to be a prophet. Any comments or closing thoughts on yes, Ed? Right. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. And in fact, the youngsters, the children, and you shape them in the way you want to shape them. Sad. Other comments about the wicked tenants or the landowner parable? Okay, we got about 10, 15 minutes to look at the parable of the marriage feast of the king's son. This is the third and final parable Jesus spoke on this day. On this day, the parable of the marriage feast in Matthew 21, 1 through 14. I'll read it real quick. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. And he sent out his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast, and they were unwilling to come. Again he sent out other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fattened livestock are all butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast.' But they paid no attention and went their way, one to his farm, another to his business, and the rest seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. But the king was enraged and sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main highways, and as many as you find there, invite to the wedding feast.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together all they found, both evil and good, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. But when the king came in to look over the dinner guests, he saw a man there who was not dressed in wedding clothes. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you come in here without wedding clothes?' And the man was speechless. Then the king said to his servants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him out into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen.'" Parable is similar to the one called the Great Supper he had told a few weeks earlier in Luke chapter 14. But there are some differences. This parable is unique because it's considered a double parable. A double parable. The first part of the parable was directed to Jesus' foes or his enemies. But the second part had a lesson for Jesus' followers. Again, let's kind of review the characters represented here. The king would be God, the Son, Jesus. Those originally invited, the Jews. Again, the servants are the prophets. Those invited from the streets, Gentiles and sinners, those who had accepted Jesus. And how about the person dressed improperly? We'll call him a follower not fully prepared. Okay, and I think we'll see how that goes in a minute. Also note that the wedding feast stands for the abundant blessing of the Messianic kingdom. So when the first feast was ready, the king, God, sent his servants, the prophets, to tell the invited guests, the Jews in general, Jewish leaders in particular, to come. In other words, he said, hey, all things are ready, come to the feast. Sounds like a good church song, if you ask me. But what happened next? Some of the guests did what? Ignored the summons, right? While others mistreated. One had to go to a farm, right? And somebody else had to do a business. And others, again, mistreated and killed. It reminds us of how the servants were treated in the wicked tenants, right? And what was the king's response here? He was enraged, right? He was furious. And what did he do? Look at 7b here. Let me see if I can find it. The last part of verse 7. But the king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. Interesting note here is that most commentators agree that in these words that I just read, Jesus is predicting what when he talks about setting the city on fire? Destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, yeah. Assuming this is true, it's also interesting that the parable speaks of the king sending his armies, while it was the Roman army that destroyed Jerusalem. How can you work that out in your brain housing group? Right? Yeah. The Old Testament teaches that God has sometimes used ungodly forces to accomplish his purposes. Remember Assyria and Babylon? Okay? Assuming that the scholars are correct, note that Jesus referred to Jerusalem in verse 7 as the city, as their city, instead of my city. That's important, I believe. Why do you think that? Well, I think it's because when the Jews, rather, as a nation, rejected Jesus, and we see this in John 1 and 11, they ceased to be God's chosen people. And Jerusalem ceased to be the city of God. That's simple. Their choice made a bad choice. Yeah, right. What did the king do next? Look at verses 8, 9, and 10. Then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main highways, as many as you find there, and invite to the wedding feast. Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together all they found, both evil and good, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. They gathered all they found, both good and evil. Now, does that mean that God allows evil into heaven? No. But what this means is that all people, good and evil, are important to God. And that's a good lesson. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Evil and good here included those tax collectors and sinners we talked about earlier, probably some Gentiles. Notice who is missing here, those high placed Jewish leaders. They would be rejected because they rejected Jesus. That's simple. And look in the second part of the parable. When the king came to the banquet hall, he spotted a man dressed improperly. He reprimanded the man and had forcibly removed him from the festivities. Now, many people are kind of puzzled by this. It seems like on the surface you're reading here that just because a guy didn't have good clothes to come to the party, so to speak, they got booted out. Is that the case here? No, it's not. Um, I mean, it would be unfair to condemn a man just because he doesn't have nice clothes. Interesting, the author F. F. Bruce, in his book on the hard sayings of Jesus, explained that we do not know all the circumstances, but the implication is that the man who was improperly dressed could have come properly clad. Okay? He had a choice, in other words. When confronted with his failure, what did it say he was? Speechless. He couldn't even come up with an excuse. The lesson for all of Jesus' listeners then and now is that God's blessings can only be received on His terms, not ours. And he concluded, for many are called, but few are chosen. Any thoughts or comments? Okay. That about wraps up there's application that is really good. It's quite long. There's about 10 pages of it. Uh, there's three main points that Roper makes in the book here. It's an invitation to rejoice. Okay, when Jesus calls us, it's an invitation requiring a response, something on our part, and it is an invitation involving responsibility. So please, if you get a chance, look at those. I got about 30 seconds to go over these questions real quick on lesson 91. Um, what was Jesus' purpose for telling the parable of the landowner to the religious leaders? Basically, it showed how the religious leaders had used their positions of authority to achieve self enrichment, also self glorification. Also, it exposed those motives about those who wanted to kill him. Number two, what did Jewish law provide concerning unclaimed property by an heir? We talked about a little bit. That it became ownerless and could be claimed by someone else, especially someone who was working the property or working the land. To whom did the other vine owners, growers, and other people refer to? That was the Gentiles. We know that the city of Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. We talked about how the Syrian and Babylonian forces, they're ungodly, but God uses them at times. So number 5 is yes. When did the Jews cease to be God's chosen people? Yeah, basically when the Jews as a nation rejected Jesus. Um, when did Jerusalem cease to be the city of God? Same time. Same time. And last, what is the meaning of the phrase, for many are called, but few are chosen? Everyone. Everyone is called by the gospel. 2 Thessalonians 2:14 tells us that. Unfortunately, only a few are chosen. Yes, Jason. No, we're good. Well, also implied in that story about the guy who was not properly dressed is that a lot of times Jewish customs, the person who is giving the wedding feast has wedding clothes for everybody to wear, just so that somebody poor is not embarrassed. Or the implication was that he had time to go home and change, but he didn't. He didn't bother. So anyway, that concludes lesson 91. Interesting. On Sunday we're going to do lesson 95, and that's still on Tuesday. So a lot happened on Tuesday.